Even the very best cannot resist the London system.
Why are we playing the London?
The truth is, everyone thinks they know the London system until they meet someone who's seen this ultimate guide. I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, let's dive in. Your main plan is very straightforward. You develop your pieces this way, put up this pyramid of pawns, then put your pieces in between, and ultimately you have a very nice and harmonious position. Your light squared bishop controls these diagonals, your dark squared bishop is also very active, controlling these other squares, your knights are also doing a good job. This knight is having a strong grip of this square e5, you're probably gonna jump there in the future. Your other knight is also doing a more defensive role. It takes control of this square so that black can never jump there. Otherwise, you have two attackers. You're going to simply win a pawn right there. Therefore, you have a nice setup. But before we dive deeper into plans and tactical ideas of the system, we have to address the very first question.
Why are we playing this stupid line?
For us, mere mortals, simplicity is a big advantage. Secondly, playing the London is like driving a tank, just to be sure you don't scratch your bumper. Maybe it's overkill, but hey, you'll never be caught off guard. One of the main ways your opponents are going to counter the London system is by developing their bishop and offering you to trade. In most cases, you do not want to take on d6 because that would only help them to develop their queen. But what do you do instead? Most tutorials about the London system say that you should bring the bishop back to g3, hoping that your opponent is going to exchange and open up this h-file for your rook, which is going to be nice. The only problem right here is that most of your opponents aren't going to do that in reality, and if they don't take on g3 but simply castle or play any other normal moves, then this doesn't give you anything. And I think that there's a better way of going about things, because let's face it, playing the London system makes you very similar to lots of other players. And you want to stand out, you want to surprise your opponent, you want to challenge them. That is why, instead of dropping the bishop back to g3, there are a couple other interesting ideas. One of them is to land your knight on e5. This way you lock the position, you avoid simplification, and also this knight is actually one of your main assets that's going to support your attack down the line. And it's quite irritating for your opponent to handle this knight that controls all these squares, but neutralizing it is not an easy task. Let's say they castle and you just continue building your usual London setup. At some point, they will be irritated by this knight. If necessary, you can always support it with the other one. If they take it with the knight, that is just a pretty obvious blunder. They're going to lose one of their pieces right after that. If instead they try to trade with the bishop, then it's certainly much better, but it's still good for you, because after this recapture, you also kick this knight away. Notice that it can come forward. Your queen controls these two squares. Your bishop and knight, as always, control that square on e4. Therefore, the knight is pushed back somewhere, either to e8 or d7, but both ways is good for you because you just pushed your opponent backward to a more passive position. From here it attacks the pawn though, therefore you do need to defend it. And if he tries to attack it once again, you can also take advantage of the fact that his king now has no defenders. There's no knight on f6, and therefore you can pull off this typical Greek gift sacrifice with a quick winning attack. And it's interesting that if you know all these tricks, you can turn the classical bit dry London system into a very powerful and aggressive weapon. Right here you're winning the game straight away. You're threatening checkmate. If the rook moves, you can then capture this pawn on f7, and either way you're winning the game. Your knight on e5 actually takes part in lots of different tactics. Imagine your opponent goes c5, a very usual and normal looking opening move. But guess what, in this case, it's already a big mistake. You play bishop b5 check, and all of a sudden your opponent is in trouble. He cannot cover normally because your knight controls the square. He cannot play knight c6, you're going to take that. You have two attackers right here. If instead your opponent plays another natural looking move, bishop d7, then once you take it, there is a big issue for black. They cannot simply recapture, because in this case they're going to drop the bishop on d6. It will be simply up a piece. If instead they try to trade bishops first, you aren't going to simply recapture, you're going to toss in a nice in between check, knight takes c5. That's a discovered check, but more importantly, you just save this knight. And once your opponent does anything to cover his king, you then recapture this bishop on f4, ending up with an extra piece. That said, I understand it can be confusing, so many variations, and you might feel like you'll forget it right after watching the video. I actually prefer to understand chess instead of endless memorization, and if you prefer this style, I've got a free masterclass about that, and I'll drop a link below the video. Let's say he doesn't play that mistake, pawn to c5, he plays a very standard move, simply castles. Then you're going to continue with your usual setup, and now it's still not easy for black. Imagine he plays another standard opening move, knight to d7, just trying to develop his knight. Guess what? That's another tactical blunder. You've got a sudden move, knight takes f7, hitting the queen, this bishop on d6, but once the knight is recaptured, they're going to lose this bishop on d6, and you've just won that pawn on f7 with a nice position. What if your opponent does not follow the script? No problem, you just continue with your usual setup. That knight on e5 is still annoying. If he attacks it again, you defend it again. And he cannot get rid of that knight so easily. If he tries to attack it one more time, you can make use of the fact that his king is once again undefended. As soon as this knight went out of f6, the king has no defenders anymore, and you can make use of that. This time you can go knight g5, piling up against that pawn on h7, and even g6 does not stop you, because you can break open the king side with this beautiful knight sacrifice, followed by this sudden check off the queen, using the pin to the pawn. It cannot take because it's pinned. If the king moves, you deliver one more check, and he's done. He can't come here, because bishop g5 would be checkmate in 1. If the king comes back, you keep destroying his position, this time threatening checkmate in 1, and if the knight is captured, you continue with this nice checkmate. There's also another move which everyday players play a lot, while classical London tutorials somehow never address, and when your opponent does play knight to c6, you may suddenly feel like Magnus Carlsen himself.
Should have studied it. Didn't.
Initially, you continue with the standard move, knight to f3, and at this point you're at the crossroads. Some of your opponents will play bishop g4, trying to disrupt your plan, and some will continue with a more casual bishop pawn to e6. We're going to talk about both these lines. In case of e6, you continue with your usual setup, and once they challenge your bishop, offering you to trade, there is also one more idea which I like a lot, and I think it's an idea which is almost totally unknown. You can do nothing, and it's always a great thing to have on your to-do list. Right? So you can just continue with your usual setup. And once they trade on f4, they only help your pawn to advance forward, to have a really strong grip of this square on e5. They'll certainly never be able to break open the center anymore in this game, and everything is just great. You simply continue. At this point, the most played move by black is rook to e8. Don't ask me why. And as soon as you land your knight to e5, now it's even more annoying for black, because either they'll have to tolerate this knight there forever, or if they ever trade, now this pawn advances even further. And it's actually very interesting. Somehow your e3 pawn could not walk a straight line like a normal pawn. It zigzagged its way forward, and I call it the drunk pawn variation, which is actually very strong. Now it hits this knight. Again, as always, your queen controls all these squares. Your knight and bishop controls this one. Therefore, the knight is pushed back, and as soon as the knight is not there anymore, as always, you can take advantage of that and start attacking his king with the move queen to h5. Threatening queen takes h7 right away. Of course, he can block that, but your attack just goes on, and now it's very straightforward. You can push the h pawn forward, open the h file, and checkmate him right away, or bring your knight right here. Either way, it's already winning for white. What if your opponent pins your knight? Well, you follow the golden rule, treat others the way you want to be treated. Since they pinned your knight, you are going to return the favor. And on the next turn, you kick their bishop out. If it takes on f3, no problem, you recapture and they have absolutely no pressure on you. Probably you are going to expand on the queen side and put pressure down there. That is absolutely fine for you. Otherwise, if the bishop comes back, then you keep pressuring the bishop and then you land your knight to this great square, and this time the threat to c6 is real. The vast majority of your opponents do not know how to handle that, and they're going to collapse quickly. For example, if they try to attack your bishop, there's no need to move the bishop because there is a stronger move, knight takes c6. You ignore their threat completely, and you just execute your threat. And at the end of the day, you're going to win something and get a winning position. Now let me share with you a couple ideas and concepts that will surprise even advanced opponents, and even if you're an experienced London player, this might be something useful and new for you. So here's the first thing. While you can develop the knight or play e3 first, and objectively both moves are equally strong, in reality I do prefer playing e3. And I'll show you why in a second. There are a couple interesting ideas that you have here. And if instead you start with knight to f3, of course it's not the end of the world, but sometimes the issue is in some variations they can confuse you with this pin, and you may not be sure what to do about that. Therefore, playing e3 right away is a little bit more accurate. Now, here there is also one interesting idea to consider. If we do play knight f3, the classical line, There is also one very well known amongst advanced players variation, which is queen b6 hitting your pawn, and once you defend it, they then play c4 pressuring your queen. At this point, you do not really want to trade on b6 because that would only help him to open up a file for his rook. But if you slide back, which is a move you'd normally wish to play, there's a very strong follow-up bishop f5. They're sacrificing the bishop and are gaining a tempo, hitting your queen once again. But you cannot accept this bishop sacrifice because after queen takes b2, all of a sudden your rook in the corner is trapped. He's going to capture it and win the game. Now let's compare that with you delaying development of your kingside knight and instead start with a queenside knight first. Now if your opponent tries to follow the very same line, queen b6, hitting this pawn, you defend it, he attacks your queen once again, you slide back, and if your opponent tries to follow that well-known theoretical line with bishop f5, guess what? It is just a blunder. It makes no sense anymore. You simply capture the bishop and you're up a piece, and that is it. If he captures the pawn, your rook is no longer trapped. You can easily move it. It might be even easier for you to offer an exchange of queens because there is a general rule when you're up material, trade off, just to simplify matters for you. Therefore, you can play queen b1, just trying to simplify matters and go into win an endgame with an extra piece. If he captures here, you just recapture with a winning endgame. If he takes here, you can kick the queen out with your knight, and then once the queen moves, you can capture on b7 because it's always more prudent to sacrifice your opponent's pieces. There is another unknown idea. If your opponent does not go for this queen b6 side attack, but just sticks to the main line and simply tries to develop his pieces normally, there is another advantage with delaying your kingside knight development. You can trade bishops here, but now play pawn to f4 because this pawn is not blocked by the knight from f3. And that gives you a very nice variation of the stonewall attack, but with your dark squared bishop being traded off. And then as we continue, you can see that you're going to totally dominate right here with this pawn chain locking the position entirely in your favor, giving you space advantage, ensuring this excellent knight on e5, and your opponent can not do anything about that. In the previous videos that I recorded about the London system, you guys mainly commented that your opponents play some weird, unexpected moves and you're not sure how to follow up. Therefore, I'm gonna address those rare moves just as well. Let's say your opponent plays a symmetric move bishop f5. What do you do then? Of course, you could continue with standard stuff, e3 and bishop d3. In this case, you're going to trade off those light squared bishops, and that is okay, but that is not the classical London system. And there is a more aggressive approach. What I do recommend you to do is to take advantage of the weakness of your opponent's plan. And the weakness is now his queen side is no longer protected because the bishop went away to the king side. You can take advantage of that by going c4. Strike it in the center, and I do understand that it is not the classical London system, you don't know this variation, but so is your opponent. Therefore, there's no problem here. c4 not only strikes in the center, but it also opens up this path for your queen, and that is a part of our plan, to take advantage of that queenside weakness of black. Now, if your opponent captures, because it looks like a free pawn at first, you simply continue with your normal development, and you're going to take the pawn back. If he tries to hold on to this extra pawn and not let you develop your bishop, then you've got a sudden move queen to f3 hitting his rook. And you're winning the game. The most played move by black here is pawn to c6, but now you take on b8 with a sudden discovered attack. If he captures your bishop, you capture his, and you're up a piece at the end. If he tries to be trickier and trade on f1 to get rid of his hanging bishop first, then you don't recapture that one. You have a much stronger move, queen takes c6 with a check, and on the next move you just grab his rook, plus his bishop is still hanging. Moreover, he's trying to save his bishop, then there is one more unpleasant surprise, this discovered check, and you win. What if he doesn't take the bait? Well, let's say he just plays, these normal moves, and once you play c4 in response to his move bishop to f5 and just plays e6, what do you do then? Then you execute your main idea, queen to b3, hitting that pawn on b7. And of course he can defend it, in most cases they play b6, but now all these squares on the queen side are weak, and you're simply going to keep putting pressure. Typically with your knight from c3, it's not yet a threat, but nevertheless, overall, it's sort of annoying for black. Also, your rook is going to come here to add more pressure, and let's say if he just develops, then you can win the game right here. So after the trade on d5, you all of a sudden jump forward to b5 with the threat to this pawn on c7, and it's not just a pawn. Once you capture it, you're going to attack the king and the rook, therefore it's a serious threat, and you're winning the game. You can also bring the rook if you need to, but black is just collapsing right here. For example, if knight to a6 trying to guard the pawn that way, you've got another strong follow-up with a queen attack. You can see that he's already paying the price for all these weaknesses, you know. Now you're attacking the knight directly. Also, there is all sorts of discover checks coming with, you know, knight moving somewhere, exposing this discover check, and you're winning once again. If he tries bishop b4, he tries to counter-strike, there's a very rare opportunity for you to legally respond with a check by a counter check. You move the knight back, opening up a counter check, which is pretty cool. Moreover, now, of course, he can cover his king somehow, but he's going to lose this knight on a6. Moreover, if he covers that way, hoping for you to capture the knight, you have an even stronger move. Instead of capturing a knight, you can play bishop b5 with this skewer, and you're going to win the queen. Here's one more potential obstacle, and I'll show you how to turn things around. Here, if he goes for the classical variation, if you remember, we discussed that in this case, you can delay development of your knight for a little bit, because sometimes it gives you additional options. And how about your opponent playing g6? He anticipates you to have your bishop right here on d3, and in that case, that pawn chain will block the diagonal and make your bishop inactive. What do you do in that case? Well, you can still utilize the weakness of his plan, and all of a sudden grab this pawn on c5. Typically, when he's got his bishop across this diagonal, he would just recapture the pawn with no problem. But now, since he's going to develop his bishop that way, that pawn on c5 is just hanging, and you can go ahead and take it. Of course, the question is, how about he's simply playing this way, kicking your bishop, and then grabbing the pawn? Does it mean that your plan failed? Exactly when it seems so, you have a really marvelous move. Knight e4, defying all the odds. Playing the move to a seemingly most defended square of black. I really love that stuff. So here, think about this. He cannot take with a knight because it's been down to the queen. And he also cannot easily take by the pawn because in this case you're going to take here and then take the undefended knight with some more attacks. And he's going to lose something down this variation. You're going to have a winning endgame in this line. Finally, if your opponent thinks, okay, I'm going to simply retreat and I'm keeping everything protected, then after the trade on f6, you've got the final surprise. You sacrifice your queen, and then you take it back with dividends, and ultimately you end up with an extra piece and a pawn in an endgame. Some of your opponents play King's Indian defense because it is one of the most popular openings for black. In this case, the London system is possible, but is a little bit less aggressive, I should say, because then once black plays d6, you don't have access to this square anymore. Your bishop is a little bit dull, your knight cannot land to that square, and all in all, it's not as effective as in the main lines of the Queen's Gambit. Therefore, I recommend that you switch your plan and go with your knight to c3, sort of Jababa London stuff, but in this case, we simply wish to play e4 and grab the center. The beauty of this plan is that in most cases, by far, the most played move by black would be bishop g7, just sticking to their King's Indian plan. But now you can effectively grab the center, and you have a nice position. You're also threatening e5, attacking their knight, therefore they will play pawn to d6. And now there are two great plans for white. One is a classical plan with opposite side castlings. When you play queen d2, castle queenside, then launch this kingside attack against his king, and that is a beautiful plan. It works really well for white. That is one option. The other option, which will probably work even better, especially in blitz, is when you become ultra aggressive and play e5 right away. In most cases, your opponents do not know how to handle this. They trade on e5, which is good for you because now you have one more attack, this time to their queen. If they trade on d1, that's still good for you because now you also have this rook on an open file and their knight is still hanging. If the knight moves, attacking your bishop, they think that life's good because the bishop is attacked and this pawn on e5 is somewhat hanging, but you go knight to d5. Pretending to protect your bishop from this trade, but in reality, you're actually hitting this pawn. And there is no defense for black. They cannot defend by this knight, this way, because if they move the knight, you can simply take it. And other than that, there is no defense to this pawn. Meaning if they take here or play any other move, you can just continue with this knight to c7. In this case, it is a fork to the king and rook, but you don't even need the rook because you've got a stronger move. That's a checkmate in one. There is another advanced concept here, which is actually very effective, can help you to win games quickly. When your opponent goes for c5, the classical approach, aiming for knight c6, bishop f5, or queen b6, all that stuff. Against that, of course, you can continue with c3 and just classical London stuff. That is perfectly fine. But I found that knight c3 is very effective, especially against that c5 move, the Jubaba London, because with c5, they're almost automatically continuing with knight c6, because that is how they play this classical system. But in this case, knight c6 is a losing blunder, because you've got knight b5 with the threat of knight coming here to c7, forking his king and rook, and black has no defense already. That is the issue for them. With the knight on b8, they could play knight a6 and cover the square that way, but with knight on c6, they're just totally defenseless against this fork. Let's say they play e5 trying to give up a pawn, but after the capture, now their knight is hanging, it needs to go somewhere. Let's say they go to e4, and now that's another favorite moment of Igor Nation, when you're taking souls. Queen takes d5. Seems that you're taking pawns, but you're taking souls. You're sacrificing the queen, and then throwing the octopus. The strongest and most beautiful move ever, and once the king moves anywhere, you get back your queen, and you end up with 2 pawns and an attacking position in a winning endgame. And of course, the scariest move for your opponents? When you subscribe to this channel. And if you want to know the easiest strategy to dominate middle games, check out that video right there.